I'm back with my review of Tanks in Hell, a Marine Corps tank company on Tarawa by Oscar E. Gilbert and Roman Concierge. To put it briefly, I love this book. It's an excellent example of well-done military history. The research is impeccable. The authors used primary sources from the National Archives, the Marine Corps Archives, the Naval Archives, as well as first-hand accounts from veterans who were there with the tank company on Tarawa, including Company Commander Edward Bale. The motivation for this book goes back to Mr. Concierge's interest in what happened to the tank company on Tarawa. There have been many representations of their activities there. Many of them were wrong, and it didn't make sense to Mr. Concierge, so he set off on a project to do the research and retrace the steps of that tank company. And the authors did an admirable job of doing that. As I mentioned in the preview, the book deals with what happened to Charlie Company and the ordeal they faced on Tarawa on November 20th, 21st, and 22nd, 1943. And in the process, it deals with the genesis of Marine Corps and American armored doctrine in the Pacific for the rest of the war. The Marines had recognized throughout the development of their amphibious warfare doctrine in the 1920s, and especially the 1930s, that direct fire support in the form of tanks would be needed in the face of a determined opposition to an amphibious landing. The problem was, by the time the first of those landings took place at Tarawa, they hadn't worked out the proper doctrine how to use those tanks. And it turned out to be a series of battlefield expedients that were worked out by then Lieutenant Bale and an infantry battalion commander because it had to get done. Originally, the original plan called for the tanks to land and dash to the other side of the island unsupported. The problem is they ran into Japanese infantrymen equipped with magnetic mines at the shape charges at the end of poles, and they didn't have infantry support to guard against those threats. So most of the tanks were knocked out on D-Day. One of the strengths of this book is the analysis. The authors do a really good job of combining research and first-hand accounts of the men who were there. Sometimes, as was demonstrated by the work of S.L.A. Marshall during World War II, different people see things different ways. They might be on the same tank crew, but they'll tell you different accounts of things that happened. One of the things I liked about this book was when that happened, they would tell you both accounts, or they would tell you the contradicting accounts if they contradicted, and then based on their research, they would make a conclusion. They would come to a conclusion, but they would let you know why they came to that conclusion. Battle narratives at the tactical level are very difficult, and they did a really good job of organizing those. Each chapter deals with one day of the battle. So each day gets its own chapter. Each tank platoon gets its own section of the chapter. So by breaking it down that way, by organizing it that way, it makes it easier to follow. Then at the end of each chapter, they have charts, they have diagrams, they have timelines that help you make sense of what you just read, because again, it can be a little confusing. But I really liked how they did it. Another strength of the book is the background information that's given. We follow Charlie Company through their training. We see how they trained, and in some cases how they didn't train. They really didn't have the best equipment to work with in 1941, 1942, and into 1943. And they really went into the Tarawa battle unprepared. Another aspect of that is the background on the Sherman tank itself. We all know that there were many versions of the M4 tank, and there's a whole section that deals with those. Now, not being much of a gearhead or a tech head, sometimes my eyes glazed over a little bit, but that was useful information because I had a picture in my mind of how those tanks would perform under the situation that they were in. Another area like that, an entire chapter was dedicated to the radios and the communication equipment that they used. And again, at first I was thinking this is a little bit too much detail. But once we get into the battle narrative and you find out that Lieutenant Bale was out of contact with most of his company through the whole battle because of the substandard and obsolete communications equipment they had, it made it that much more clear as to why they did not have this contact and why each platoon pretty much operated independently, even though Betio Island, the fortified part of Tarawa, was very small. The lack of communication meant that each platoon kind of did its own thing. Going back to the battle narrative, that's really the meat of the book. It's the best part of the book, as you might expect. But because of the proper preparation that you're given, the account of the tanks, the training, the communications equipment, all that stuff leading up to it, you understand better why things happened the way they did. You understand why the tanks were out of communication. You understand why they had trouble achieving their objectives on D-Day and really D+1. And the real cleanup didn't come about till D+2, when Edward Bale and this infantry battalion commander started working out how the tanks were supposed to work together. They realized that tanks and infantry have to work together. The tanks can't go in unsupported, but the infantry can't either. They have to have the direct fire support of the tanks, because the Japanese were dug in concrete and steel emplacements covered with coconut logs and sand that tended to absorb the fire even from the tanks. A lot of times it took numerous 75mm high explosive rounds to punch through. So it took the infantry and the tanks working together to clear the island. It's difficult to see how the infantry could have succeeded without the tanks, and the tanks certainly couldn't have succeeded without the infantry. So you see that as it develops, and how it develops into the genesis of Marine Corps and Army armor doctrine in the Pacific for the rest of the war. And Ed Bale, according to Ed Bale, that was what they came up with on D+1 because they had to. They had no choice. They weren't going to be able to advance and do what they needed to do without coming up with those expedients. The biggest problem they had between tanks and infantry was the lack of communication. The infantry had no way to talk to the tanks, and tanks had no way to talk to the infantry. The infantry officers had no training in how tanks were supposed to operate. And the tankers' training was not really adequate in terms of the way they were supposed to be employed. Now, I won't give away everything that's in the book, but the main thing that Bale came up with was how to communicate with the infantry and how they needed to work together. As I said, at the end of each chapter, you have a series of maps, charts, timelines to help you piece the action together. Very, very strong part of the book here. There's a detailed map of the island itself that helps you follow the action. Also, there are a series of aerial photos that were taken during the battle, and that help you place the tanks, and you can see what the atmosphere was like, what the environment was like. You don't have when we think of armored operations, it's nothing like it was in Europe. Nothing but downed coconut trees and debris everywhere, and tanks essentially operating in small groups or alone. There are no wide sweeping movements around the enemy flank. It's all direct fire at the tactical level. And you can see that from these photographs. In the course of the tactical discussion, the accounts of the veterans really help bring it to life. It helps you realize that the tanks in combat are not just steel vehicles or counters to be moved across the map. These things had real people in them, and they had real experiences. And reading the accounts, you recognize that they had difficult jobs under extremely stressful circumstances, and they still got it done. And there's an entire appendix that goes through the inside of the M4 tank and what each crewman had to do. Let's just say that it was a lot more than driving around and shooting stuff. Another thing I liked was at the end of the book, in another appendix, it tells you what happened to the surviving members of the tank company, those that they know their fate. And that adds to the story, because you become attached to some of these guys and you want to know what happened to them. For example, Edward Bale went on to serve the rest of World War II. He served on Okinawa, served on Saipan, and as well as in Korea and Vietnam. And you find out a lot of these other tank crewmen too. You find out what happened to them. And again, I'm not going to give that away because it is quite interesting. Now, there aren't many weaknesses to the book. There's a couple, but again, these are probably subjective on my part, but we'll list them. First, sometimes the accounts of the veterans get a little bit confusing. There were a couple of times I wasn't sure who was speaking, but again, that's very minor. Another time, a couple of times, maybe the comments didn't seem in the right place, maybe a little out of context. But again, that's a very small criticism. The other small criticism goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the technical aspects. And again, that is probably just me. Some people will probably eat that stuff up. But what I thought was a weakness, maybe a weakness when I was reading it, turned into a strength once I got to the battle narrative, because it helped me understand what was happening and why it was happening. Because I understood certain aspects of the M4 tank and the communications problems that they had, it added tremendously to the tactical battle narrative. So what seemed like a weakness when I was reading it actually turned into a strength. Overall, I give this book a big thumbs up. Very, very well done. I can't recommend it highly enough. As I mentioned before, one of my primary interests is U.S. amphibious doctrine as it was developed in the 1920s and 30s and how it was executed during World War II. This added to my knowledge of that. That's what I did my master's thesis on. This added to my knowledge. It helped me understand how tank doctrine was developed for amphibious operations and how important it was. The common picture of amphibious operations a lot of times doesn't include tanks, but historians have started to recognize that. Isley and Kroll in U.S. Marines and Amphibious Warfare go so far as to say that the victory at Iwo Jima would not have been possible without tanks. It's also very difficult to see how Okinawa or Saipan could have been done successfully without tanks, at least not without a whole lot more casualties. The Japanese commander on Okinawa even went so far as to say our struggle with the enemy is a struggle against his tanks. So even the Japanese by that point had recognized the importance of U.S. armor and how it was being employed. So again, I recommend this book very highly. If something you're interested in, I recommend going out and buying it or checking it out in your library or whatever if you can find it. But very, very well done. And please leave me your comments. Tell me what you think. If you'd like to suggest what I should read next or just talk about this book, please let me know. Please give us a subscribe and a like, and I'll be back with the next installment of what I'm reading sometime soon.